Welcome back to the next in our Bible series for January, looking at the beginning of our scriptures at the book of Genesis. And in this second session, we're looking at Genesis chapter 4 and 5, the story of Cain and Abel, and then some of Adam's other descendants too. And as I said before, I think this really does follow on from Genesis 1 to 3. Genesis 1 to 3 all took place within the Garden of Eden, was very definitely part of that definitive act of creation in which we reveal the truth of creation as God would have us understand it. And in particular what that means about our relationship with him, the freedom that he gives us, the capacity to act of our own free will, which includes making mistakes, but his desire that we always return to him. But we see the outworkings of that sinfulness, particularly in the story of Cain and Abel. So at this point, Adam and Eve have actually been cast out of the Garden of Eden. That's at the end of chapter 3. And now we hear what happens next. And the man, Adam, knew his wife, Eve. And that word knew, you often hear it said, did he know her in the biblical sense? It's used throughout the book of Genesis and onwards to mean have a relationship with, to have a child with, to have marital relations with. It sort of encapsulates a social and cultural relationship, which includes having sexual intercourse, but also it's slightly more than that. It's almost marriage, but it's definitely an idea that two people share one purpose in bearing a child. And when we're talking about marriage, actually, I think that's quite important. That actually it's something about that shared understanding of creativity and passing on our life and our faith that is important when we're talking about our sexual relationships. But also that word know, it encapsulates lots of those ideas which we've already had from Genesis chapters 2 and 3 about what it means to be creative. So it includes ideas about sight, and notice there was a description of God watching Adam and Eve in the garden. It includes knowing, it includes understanding, and it also includes that authority. And a shared authority is important in our relationships as well. So in that little word which gets used so much about relationships, I think there's a huge amount of detail which comes from our reading of Genesis. So it's almost as if in that relationship between Adam and Eve, in which Eve conceives and bears Cain and then Abel, we're taking all of that description of creation that happens within Eden, taking it and allowing it to have a moment of existence outside of the garden. And remember, Eden means pleasure, delight. So it's in that little moment of existence outside of the garden when we recognise a revelation of the creative power of God, which we have brought to bear. So that little word contains a huge amount of detail. And they give birth to Cain and to Abel. And the name Cain means labour, pain, waiting. It means to be productive. That's why the NRSV translates Adam saying as, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. So it does. The word Cain, the name Cain, actually reflects those sayings of God that would be our human experience. And I think that this story about Cain and Abel really is our understanding of what happens when that labour, when that pain is not productive, is not creative, is not fruitful in the way that God wants it to be. So we know that that suffering, that pain, that endurance, that labour is part of our human condition, is part of our human experience. But God still wants it, we still want it to be productive, to be fruitful, to lead towards God. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when, as Genesis 4:7 says, sin's desire allures us away, and we're taken over by anger and jealousy and violence. And Genesis very candidly acknowledges that sin is attractive, is alluring, is desirous. It wants to tempt us away from doing the right thing. But this is what happens: enmity, jealousy. When we don't make that choice. Why is sin so desirous? Because we have that freedom to make a choice about it. That's the very nature of sin and sinfulness, as described in these opening chapters to Genesis. So Cain obviously is lured by that sinfulness. It kills his brother, and his punishment, interestingly, 4:14, is to be without place, is to be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And that's so interesting that when Genesis has been all about giving things its proper place and its proper purpose, it's those things that Cain loses as punishment for his act of sin. And then there's an irony in 4:16 that actually the very first place that gets a toponym, that gets a name with the story explained as to why it gets that name, is Nod, which is east of Eden, which is where Cain settles, which means wandering. So there's an irony that the first place out of Eden that receives a name is a place without a place. It is wandering, is a place that means to be lost, to be searching, to be wandering. And then the rest of chapter 4 describe how Cain goes about recovering that sense of identity, that sense of place, that sense of purpose through establishing a family and through establishing civilizations. So he knows his wife, and she bears a son called Enoch, and he builds a city straight off the bat, which is so important to their place-making, identity-making. And he named it Enoch after his son Enoch. So there's an idea that actually family and citizenship give us these identities because they hold together. That is the way which as human beings we hold together these ideas of authority, labour, relationship, knowledge, that describe our interactions with one another. But it's our communities that actually hold all those things together. And that, for me, is why it's so important that the church is at the centre of that community, and that as a church our activity includes serving the community around us, because it is those things which hold all these creative forces together, as we've seen in Genesis. Note also in the middle of that list of Cain's descendants, in verses 20 and 21, we get some interesting observations that one of his descendants was the one who lived in tents and had livestock, and another was the one who played the lyre and the pipe. So actually Genesis is saying that some things are fundamental to our building community, include our domestic life, our home life, include our economics, include our cultural, music making, leisure. They're all things that help define us as communities and form us in these relationships, in this authority, in this labour, in this transfer of knowledge that we're saying are fundamental to understanding our creation and our being created in God's image. But the line of Cain sort of stops there, and in 425 we're introduced to another son of Adam, which is called Seth. And Seth, the NRSV tells you, is God appointed me. That's what Seth sort of means, that God has appointed somebody to have a distinctive role. And I think that's an interesting idea. That actually there are times and places for different people to have specific roles which are good, which doesn't make them better than anybody else, but actually says that they have a distinctive role, and that again actually is going to be fundamental to our understanding of community. That some people must take specific roles to enable community to function, including priestly roles, including religious roles, but including all sorts of other forms of leadership and authority as well. And that sort of is what Seth embodies, and I think that's how Genesis sort of leads us into following Seth's line, Adam, Seth, onwards, but saying, well, Seth obviously had a distinctive role apart from his brothers Cain and Abel, despite the fact that Cain and Abel's story is still so fundamental and important. There's another way that God wants to speak to us and work with us. So that being appointed by God, I think, is a way for us to describe how God can influence and interact and bring the world around to his purposes without contradicting our freedom and without trying to say that, well, if God can appoint the good, that still doesn't mean that he's created the bad. But he has created a world in which we can be led astray. And then we're given Seth's other descendants, but that's introduced, interestingly, with a reference back to Genesis 1:27, that we are created in the likeness of God, male and female, and we are blessed. And this is Genesis, I think, saying that we are still in creation, we are still in a creative mode, but actually that creativity is going to have to be passed down from generations to generations, and that's how the rest of Genesis is going to unfold. But that's still all part of being created in God's image, and being blessed, being spoken well of by God, and therefore our participation in creation. And actually blessing is a distinctive activity of humankind. No other animal, no other creature, no other part of the world can bless in the way that that humans do, because blessing is a verbal activity. It's an activity of speaking. It's an activity of communicating in a way that other creatures just cannot, because blessing is a reflection of our being created in the image of God. But that ability to bless, both in a priestly, religious sense and in a worldly relationship sense, actually is still passed down from Adam to his children, and therefore to us, but is proper of both male and female, Genesis says. So Seth, it says, was in the likeness of his father, and therefore in the likeness of God too. Notice Adam had other sons and daughters, verse 5:4, again, who perhaps were not appointed, but they are still present. And I think that's going to introduce this idea of being chosen, being elect, being appointed for a certain role, which is going to be important for Israel's self-understanding, but can actually help us to understand God's particular interaction with the world as well. And then we get a long list of other descendants of Adam, who each have their own particular existence. And the one I will just highlight is Enoch. Notice 5:24. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him. So Enoch doesn't, in Hebrew tradition, die, but is taken some other way up to be with God. And there are other stories about Enoch, apocryphal texts, the books of Enoch you might come across. There are lots of other stories said about Enoch, but it all comes from just that verse, where actually Enoch somehow escapes the torment of death. Which, again, I think is going to be important as the rest of scriptures unfold and we think about death, life, and the gifts that God gives to us. Just introducing that idea already. So that's a response, I think, to how Genesis deals with the fact that we are created distinctively, we are differentiated, we are each individual, and yet we are all still created in God's image, the image of the one unique God. And therefore it's those relationships which we have with one another in which we piece that image back together, which allow us to see just a glimpse of God and participate for a moment in his creative power. I hope that's been a helpful introduction to the descendants of Adam. The final descendant introduced in verse 28 or 29 is Noah, and it's his story that we'll go on to look at next. Thank you.